The courtroom was suffocating with tension. The buzz of hushed whispers filled the air like static, growing louder with every second. Reporters gripped their notepads. Spectators shifted in their seats. And victims, real people with real pain, sat stone-faced, waiting for justice. Then, he walked in. Ethan Grayson, tall, broad shoulders, slicked back hair shining under the sterile fluorescent lights, his charcoal grey designer suit molded to his frame, oozing wealth. But it wasn't just the way he dressed. It was the way he moved. Shoulders squared, head held high, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Like he owned the place. Like this was just another boardroom where he'd strong-arm his way out of trouble. The crowd tensed. They had seen his face before, on news headlines, in glossy business magazines. Ethan Grayson, the investment tycoon, the Wall Street king, the billionaire philanthropist. But they knew the truth. He wasn't a genius. He was a thief. A man who had built his empire on deception, swindling struggling families, stealing retirements, and leaving hard-working people in financial ruin. And now, after years of dodging justice, he was finally in court, facing the reckoning he never thought would come. The courtroom doors swung open again, and a hush fell over the crowd. Judge Monica Lee entered. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to command attention. Her presence alone did that. All rise for the Honorable Judge Monica Lee, the bailiff announced. The entire courtroom rose, except for one person, Ethan Grayson. He sat back, flipping casually through a legal pad, his expression bored, as if this entire trial was beneath him. A ripple of disbelief spread through the crowd. Even his own lawyer looked alarmed, whispering urgently to him. But Ethan just flicked his wrist dismissively. Judge Lee reached her bench, pausing for a moment. Her gaze was sharp, but her face betrayed nothing. "You may be seated," she said, voice calm but firm. Everyone obeyed, but the atmosphere had shifted. Tension wasn't just in the air anymore. It was thick enough to choke on. Because today, Ethan Grayson was about to learn something money couldn't buy. Justice. Ethan Grayson wasn't just rich. He was the kind of rich that had power. Luxury yachts, mansions on both coasts, private jets, lavish parties where champagne flowed like water. And he had built it all on lies. Grayson Investments, his so-called financial empire, was a fraud from the start. He had promised hard-working people a future. Told struggling families he could double their life savings, looked retirees in the eye and assured them their golden years would be secure. And then, he took everything. College funds, gone. Retirement savings, vanished. Homes, foreclosed. By the time investigators caught up to him, the damage was done. Families left in ruins. People losing everything. And yet, even as he sat in the courtroom, surrounded by the wreckage of lives he had destroyed, Ethan didn't care. He leaned back in his chair, checked his phone, smirked like this was all just a game. The prosecutor stepped forward, voice steady. "Your Honor, today we will hear from the people whose lives were devastated by Mr. Grayson's actions." The first witness took the stand. Angela Martinez, a widowed mother of 3. She had invested everything she had with Grayson, her life savings, her children's college fund. "I begged them not to take my house," she said, voice trembling. "I told them I had kids. I told them I had nowhere to go, but they didn't care. We lived in our car for 2 weeks." Silence. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Ethan!" He scrolled through his phone, didn't even look at her. The prosecutor's voice sharpened. "Mr. Grayson, put your phone away." Ethan barely glanced up. "I was just checking something important." Judge Lee's gaze hardened. "Now!" A beat. For a moment, it looked like he might argue. Then, lazily, he set the phone down. But the damage was already done. Angela's lip trembled, like she couldn't believe the sheer lack of basic human decency. The next witness took the stand, Peter Vaughan, retired firefighter. 35 years of service, every single dollar he had saved for retirement, gone. I spent my whole life running into burning buildings, he said, voice thick with anger. And this man, he burned my future to the ground without a second thought. And yet, Ethan smirked. He actually smirked. The gallery erupted into furious whispers. The judge's gavel cracked against the bench. Order in the court! Silence. Judge Lee turned to Ethan. This is not a boardroom meeting, Mr. Grayson. You will treat this court with respect. Ethan tilted his head, amusement flickering in his eyes. Like he enjoyed this. Like the suffering of his victims was just another story for the press to eat up. But what Ethan didn't realize was that this wasn't about headlines. This wasn't about the public image he so carefully crafted. This was about justice. And it was coming for him. The trial was a spectacle. Outside the courthouse, news vans lined the street, their cameras capturing every detail. Inside, the air crackled with anticipation. The prosecution had spent days laying out the evidence. Bank records, falsified documents, emails that made it impossible for Ethan Grayson to slither his way out of this one. But it wasn't until the third day of the trial that the final nail in his coffin was driven. The lead prosecutor stepped forward, a thick stack of papers in hand. Your Honor, she began, these emails paint a clear picture of Mr. Grayson's intent, his callous disregard for the people who trusted him. She turned to the jury. These are his own words. She lifted a page, her voice sharp as she read, Make the numbers look good. We need these suckers to sign on the dotted line. The room fell into dead silence. Then, gasps. Angela Martinez, sitting in the front row, shook her head in disbelief. Peter Vaughan clenched his fists, but Ethan, he leaned back in his chair and smirked. The prosecutor turned to face him, her tone like ice. Mr. Grayson, do you recognize this email? His lawyer shot up from his seat. Objection, Your Honor. This question has been asked and answered in pre-trial hearings. Judge Lee raised a hand. Overruled. Her eyes locked onto Ethan. The defendant will answer the question. For the first time, something flickered in Ethan's expression. Annoyance. He exhaled slowly, leaned into the microphone, and said, Yes, I recognize it. But let's not pretend it means what you're implying. A pause. Then with a casual shrug, he added, It's just business talk. You wouldn't understand. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Someone in the audience muttered, Unbelievable. Judge Lee's gavel slammed down. Order in the court. The murmurs died instantly. Judge Lee's stare bore into Ethan. Mr. Grayson, I strongly advise you to watch your tone. This is not a boardroom, and I am not one of your employees. But Ethan didn't flinch, didn't even blink. If anything, he enjoyed the attention. As if this was all a game to him, as if he still believed he was untouchable. The trial dragged on for another week. Ethan's lawyer threw everything at the wall. Character witnesses, technicalities, attempts to discredit the prosecution's case. But the evidence was overwhelming. And Judge Lee? She saw through every trick. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, victims, curious onlookers who just wanted to see justice unfold. Ethan sat at the defense table, his posture as relaxed as ever, as if he knew what was coming, as if he still believed he could buy his way out of this. Then, all rise. Judge Monica Lee entered, her face unreadable. The room fell into breathless silence. She took her seat, glanced at Ethan. Then, Mr. Grayson, she said, her voice steady, deliberate, final. You have been found guilty on all counts of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The air shifted. The weight of those words crashed down like a hammer. But Ethan, he still didn't react, didn't flinch, until Judge Lee continued. The evidence against you is overwhelming. The testimonies of your victims paint a clear picture of your actions. You manipulated, exploited, and destroyed countless lives, all for personal gain. A beat of silence. Then, her tone hardened. Throughout this trial, you have shown a blatant lack of remorse. Your behavior in this courtroom has been nothing short of disgraceful. Ethan shifted slightly. His smirk faltered. Just barely. Judge Lee leaned forward. Justice, Mr. Grayson, is not about wealth. It is not about power. It is not about privilege. Her voice dropped lower. It is about accountability. The room was silent. You could hear the rustling of papers, the ticking of the clock, the shallow, uneven breath of someone in the audience. Then, Judge Lee spoke the words that shook Ethan Grayson to his core. Therefore, she declared, I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison. Gasps. Shock. A reporter's pen clattered to the floor. Angela Martinez's hand shot up to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Peter Vaughan exhaled, a breath he had been holding for years. Ethan Grayson. His face froze. The blood drained from his cheeks. 25 years. Not a slap on the wrist. Not a cushy white-collar prison sentence. Not probation. A full quarter of a century. Judge Lee wasn't finished. Furthermore, she continued, I am ordering the immediate liquidation of your assets to repay the victims of your crimes. A stunned murmur rippled through the courtroom. Angela sobbed into her hands. Peter Vaughan stared, disbelieving. Ethan shot up from his chair, his face red with rage. You can't do this, he shouted. I'm Ethan Grayson. You can't treat me like some common criminal. Judge Lee's gavel slammed down. Mr. Grayson, sit down. But Ethan wouldn't stop. This is a joke. I'll appeal this. I'll have your career ruined. Bailiffs moved closer, ready, waiting. Judge Lee? She stayed calm, unmoved. This is my courtroom, Mr. Grayson, she said, her voice cold. And you will show respect. The bailiff seized Ethan by the arms. No, you don't get it. I have connections. His voice grew fainter as he was dragged from the courtroom, the moment the door shut behind him. Applause. Thunderous. The courtroom erupted with it. Angela Martinez wept into her hands. Peter Vaughan let out a breathless laugh. Even the reporters, the hardened, skeptical journalists, looked, just for a second, satisfied. Judge Lee stood, faced the crowd. Then in a voice as steady as ever, she said, Justice has been served. Outside the courthouse, reporters scrambled for interviews. Angela Martinez, standing on the steps, clutched her purse tightly. A microphone was shoved toward her. How do you feel after today's verdict? Angela hesitated. Then, I feel relieved. A pause. But the truth is, no sentence will erase the damage he caused. My kids and I, we're still rebuilding. But at least now, we have hope. Nearby, Peter Vaughan spoke with a friend. It's not just about the years he got, he said, shaking his head. It's about the message. People like him think they're untouchable. Today proved they're not. And inside her chambers, Judge Monica Lee sat quietly, staring out the window at the commotion below. She didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel victory. She felt resolved. Because justice isn't about winning. It's about balance. And today, the scales had finally tipped in the right direction. Ethan Grayson's name would make headlines for weeks. But for the people he had wronged, the chapter was finally closing. Because today, they had seen something rare, something powerful. Justice! And they would never forget it.